I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch network. So what has happened to Jeffrey Clark, the rogue DOJ assistant United States attorney who was involved in environmental issues, who was used by Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans as part of their overall attempt to overthrow our democracy? Remember, Jeffrey Clark was the individual who Donald Trump wanted to appoint as the acting United States Attorney General because Jeffrey Clark was willing to send a memo to states telling him to overthrow the results of their elections so that Donald Trump would be declared the winner over the true winner, President Biden, then candidate Joe Biden. So what happened to Jeff Clark? We know that Jeff Clark was hit with a Department of Justice subpoena. We know that Jeff Clark is not only that, but hit with a search warrant that was executed at his residence. And he was wearing his underwear when he walked out of the door. We also know that Jeffrey Clark has been investigated not just by the DOJ, by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, and also there have been disciplinary proceedings to revoke his license to practice law that have been initiated by the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, ODC, for the Washington, D.C. Board of Professional Responsibility, essentially disbarring Jeffrey Clark so he can't practice law anymore. I want to talk about a district court ruling, a federal court ruling that basically will allow the proceedings against Jeffrey Clark that were brought to remove his legal license, that were brought by ODC, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel. It allows their efforts to now proceed, and I think ultimately Jeffrey Clark is going to lose his legal license. And so back on July 19th of 2022, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel in Washington, D.C. initiated proceedings against Jeff Clark to revoke his legal license. And the jurisdiction for these types of proceeding falls under the Superior Court of the District of Columbia and the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, because remember, Jeffrey Clark worked for the Department of Justice at the relevant time period. The DOJ, of course, is located in Washington, D.C. And so the Office of Disciplinary Counsel initiates these proceedings to revoke Jeffrey Clark's legal license. And Jeffrey Clark then tries to do what all these MAGA Republicans do, which is delay, delay, delay. And frankly, he had successfully been able to delay this since July 19th of 2022. And finally, the district court, the federal court, stepped in and said, no more delays. ODC, proceed with your disciplinary action against Jeff Clark. Here's what Jeff Clark did, and I'll try to break it down for you in the simplest terms because it actually is a little bit complicated. Because Jeffrey Clark worked for the Department of Justice, a department within the federal government, Jeffrey Clark argued that the disciplinary proceedings before the District of Columbia Court should be removed to federal court in Washington, D.C., that the federal court for Washington, D.C., they're the ones that should have jurisdiction, not the Superior Court in Washington, D.C. And so he filed this removal action. Thereafter, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel sent another subpoena to Jeffrey Clark saying, you may have removed it to federal court, but we're proceeding as though, this has the jurisdiction is before the Court of Appeal. And then Jeffrey Clark filed a motion to remove that to federal court. Another subpoena was issued by ODC. Jeffrey Clark filed another motion to remove that to federal court. And finally, the Superior Court of the District of Columbia basically said, look, we're going to wait until the federal court in Washington, D.C. makes a ruling about Jeffrey Clark's claim that this has federal jurisdiction, not District of Columbia jurisdiction, because it has a federal question or because jurisdiction may be there because it involves the Department of Justice. So let's wait till the federal court makes that decision. Well, it took about 8 or 9 months of briefing before the federal judge made its order, but the federal judge just made its order, and in a 36-page opinion, here's the ruling. For the foregoing reason, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel's motion for remand, a motion for remand means to go from the federal court, removed from District of Columbia Court, to federal court. Remand means bring it back down to the District of Columbia Court. So for the foregoing reasons, ODC's motion to remand, to bring the case back to the District of Columbia Superior Court, is granted. In addition, because the court, the federal court, lacks subject matter jurisdiction over this matter, Mr. Clark's motion to stay the subpoena response deadlines and motion to quash are denied as moot. In other words, the federal court said, because the federal court in Washington, D.C. doesn't have jurisdiction, we're going to not just remand it, but we don't even have the ability to rule on Jeffrey Clark's efforts to try to stay or quash these subpoenas that have been issued by the Office of Disciplinary Counsel that regulates legal licenses in Washington, D.C. So for all practical purposes, what this means is that the disciplinary proceedings now are back on track, and Jeffrey Clark will now face these proceedings where his legal license is on the line. Frankly, I think his legal license, in my opinion, should be the least of his worries now, especially with Special Counsel Jack Smith's ongoing investigation, the Department of Justice criminal investigation, Fani Willis's investigation, and the role that Jeffrey Clark played in trying to overthrow our democracy. And let me just read a section of this court opinion, which ultimately, again, remanded the case back to the Superior Court in Washington, D.C., rejected Jeffrey Clark's argument. But let me just read from you the factual section that you could just see what Jeffrey Clark did, just to remind you. So on July 19, 2022, ODC filed with the board that regulates licensures of lawyers, a petition instituting formal disciplinary proceedings against Jeffrey Clark, together with a specification of charges. The specification of charges alleges that Jeffrey Clark, who at all relevant times concurrently served in the Department of Justice as an Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division, an Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division, quote, attempted to engage in conduct involving dishonesty in violation of DC Bar Rules 8.48, and C, and attempted to engage in conduct that would seriously interfere with the administration of justice in violation of DC Bar rules. These charges arose out of Mr. Clark's alleged conduct in the wake of the 2020 presidential election. The specification alleges that despite having, quote, no involvement or responsibility for DOJ's post-election investigation into allegations of fraud irregularities, on December 28, 2020, Mr. Clark tasked a senior counsel in the Civil Division with researching the authority of state legislatures to send unauthorized slate of electors to Congress. Mr. Clark allegedly then used this research to write what came to be referred to as the proof of concept letter, which he emailed to the Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue. The proof of concept letter, which was drafted to be signed by Mr. Rosen, Mr. Donahue, and Mr. Clark, and addressed to the Georgia Governor, Speaker of the House, and President pro temp of the Senate, quote, recommended that the governor call the Georgia legislature into special session, and argued that if the governor refused to do so, the legislature had the authority to convene such a session on its own initiative. So this proof of concept letter that Jeffrey Clark wanted to send to the state governors, with this one being addressed to Georgia, but then to all of the other states where Donald Trump lost, was a call by the DOJ demanding, and again, under the seal of the Department of Justice, that the states call into session their state legislatures so that they could take their own vote to try to proclaim that Donald Trump was the winner, even when Donald Trump lost in the state. And then Jeffrey Clark did the exact tactic of all these MAGA Republicans. He filed this removal motion to federal court, argued that because he worked for the DOJ, that it should be heard by a federal judge, not a District of Columbia judge. Federal judge ultimately says nope, but it took 8 months of delay. And now finally the case is going to be back on track. But I want to highlight this. It is another MAGA Republican delay tactic, number one. But number two, though it took about 8 or 9 months, justice is now going to be served. And as I said, I predicted that Jeffrey Clark is going to lose his legal license. So wheels of justice moving slower there than we'd like, but nonetheless, a good outcome. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Hit subscribe. We're on our way to 1.5 million subscribers. Thanks to your awesome support. Check us out. Patreon.com/MeidasTouch, and wherever you get audio podcasts, subscribe to the MeidasTouch podcast. All right, hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and have a great day.
Hey Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.